You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 6th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, there's just a fortnight before the administration changes in the US. Can there be meaningful progress on the Middle East before January the 20th? Austria's Chancellor has resigned as coalition talks collapse. We'll get the detail from Monocle's Chris Chermak.
Hello, Georgina. Yes, a collapse of the Austrian government coalition talks will lead to perhaps the first far-right government in post-war history.
And we'll catch up with 6 months of political chaos in France. Plus, will Japan and the US fall out over the blocking of the sale of US steel to Nippon? We'll have a roundup of news from Asia and finally...
And the Golden Globe goes to... Shogun.
We'll hear about the winners and the losers at Hollywood's big night. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Russia says that Ukraine has launched a new attack in the Kursk region, an area of western Russia from which Russian troops have been trying to eject Ukrainian forces for the past 5 months. South Korean investigators will seek an extension of a warrant to arrest impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol, an official said today, as an anti-graft agency asked police to take over efforts to execute the arrest of the embattled leader. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is increasingly likely to announce he intends to step down, though he's not made a final decision, an insider said. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Joe Biden has just a fortnight left in office, and he and his administration are making a final push to help broker a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas to end the fighting in Gaza and to try and secure the release of Hamas-held Israeli captives. Biden's also announced a planned further $8 billion of arms sales to Israel. Well, I'm joined now by Natasha Lindstadt, who's a professor of government at the University of Essex. Good morning to you, Natasha. Thanks for coming on the show. The extra weapons funding is deeply unpopular in some quarters because of the continued strikes on Gaza by Israel. Now, there are reports of a surge in Israeli military action this weekend. Medics say Israeli airstrikes in Gaza killed 105 Palestinians. I wonder if you could just bring us up to date with what's been going on the ground over the last couple of days.
No, that's exactly right. What has happened, that there has been an escalation in the fighting, that Israel has become more aggressive and has been accused of targeting a hospital. And there have been reports of all kinds of civilian casualties. The Israelis claim that they are targeting Hamas fighters. So while this is going on and the death toll has escalated to 45,000 Palestinians that have died in the conflict, the hunger crisis has become increasingly acute. While we hear talks about a possible ceasefire, while both sides, supposedly representatives of Hamas and Israel, are reportedly in Qatar to talk about a ceasefire, we see that Israel has been escalating and ramping up the attacks.
And of course, the $8 billion comes after the US approved the sale of $20 billion worth in fighter jets and other military equipment to Israel. What does this extra $8 cover?
Well, I mean, I think the first question that people are probably thinking is why is the U.S. giving Israel so much money while they're trying to pressure Netanyahu's government into a ceasefire? And we've seen that with the Biden administration, and this has actually been pretty consistent with the way U.S. foreign policy worked with Israel, is while there is often some frustration with what Israel is doing, whether it be expansion into the West Bank or the aggression recently in Gaza, the war in Gaza and the way it's been playing out. There is also this strong pressure to continue to provide Israel with the military support that it thinks that it needs to defend itself. So there are often pre-existing plans in place that lend itself towards all this money going towards Israel, because there is billions of arms sale that they had already agreed to, and so these things have been agreed upon earlier, and then they execute it. And while it seems almost not a good timing to do so, because it really doesn't give the U.S. a lot of leverage.
As you mentioned, ceasefire talks have begun in Doha. I wonder who's involved and if there's any likelihood that there may be an agreement and that it will happen before January the 20th.
So I'm very pessimistic that there's going to be any kind of agreement that's going to take place. And that's because while there's incredible pressure on Netanyahu in Israel to bring back the some 100 hostages that are still in Gaza, there is also pressure from his right-wing cabinet members to eliminate Hamas. And so Hamas reportedly was about 25,000 strong before the October attack. Reportedly, they've lost maybe 20,000 members, although it's hard to know exactly, but they've recruited around 15,000. So they're recruiting almost just as quickly as they are being killed. And that for Netanyahu's right-wing government is a problem. And so that's why I see it very, very unlikely that there's going to be a ceasefire anytime soon. The U.S., as I just mentioned, is sending very mixed signals by providing all this military support. Some of this would have been agreed upon beforehand. But that is really, at the end of the day, Israel is not getting a strong enough signal from the U.S. that they have to push for a ceasefire. And the demands are Hamas wants a prisoner exchange if they want the hostages released. And I don't see that Israel is going to agree to it. I think they're going to get really close to a ceasefire, agreeing to it, and then Israel will back out at the last minute.
We've been told that there's an Israeli list of 34 hostages to be exchanged, but there seems to be some disagreement on whether this is official or not.
Right, exactly. So they do want a big win for all the pressure, the domestic pressure the Israelis want. A win by bringing some of the hostages back. But the issue is that there would need to be a prisoner exchange, as I mentioned, from Hamas. And when they've gotten close to having some kind of deal with a ceasefire, and I know that there have been some hostages exchanged in the past for some prisoners, but when they've gotten close to it, Netanyahu has come up with some sort of reason or an additional stipulation for whether it be added screenings for those that are trying to return, that has torpedoed these types of deals. I mean, we'll have to see. They may end up getting some hostages back for some prisoners, but the idea of having an actual ceasefire that is actually meaningful, I think it's really unlikely.
So I wonder if Trump, who as a campaigner on the outside attacked the government, can effectively manage it once he's on the inside, and if his isolationist policies will stop any progress on US initiatives to broker peace in the Middle East.
So Trump is such an enigma, right? As you mentioned, that he claims he's sort of like some sort of no-war president. But when he took over in 2017, there wasn't any conflicts going on in the world, so he could brag about this without having to actually do anything. He's very, very pro-Israeli. He's very close to Netanyahu. And as I mentioned, there's just these pre-existing plans in place that mean that the same amounts of money are going to go to Israel no matter what. And I think outwardly he's going to be very supportive of Netanyahu and whatever he wants to do. There is probably going to be some pressure from the likes of like the Freedom Caucus and different elements within American politics that don't want to spend as much. We actually saw for the first time in U.S. history pressure from Congress members that didn't want to give aid to Israel, just feeling that there had been too much money that had been spent. And it wasn't even coming from the left, but more from the right, the left as well to some extent. But what I see is that Trump is going to be a continuation of Biden's policies that were very, very pro-Israeli.
So the UN aid agency for Palestinian refugees is reportedly preparing to shut down in Gaza and the West Bank. And this is because of the Knesset legislation, which significantly curbs its operation. That was passed in October. It's now nearing implementation. But you mentioned sort of US government mixed messages, well, particularly on this issue, because we've seen Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin writing to their Israeli counterparts, warning that banning UNRWA would devastate the Gaza humanitarian response at a very critical moment. But Biden has signed into law congressional legislation halting US funding to UNRWA until March. So I guess the question now is, will the Republican-controlled Congress make that move permanent?
Yeah, I think that's possible, that's what's going to happen. I mean, it's just really difficult for the U.S. to persuade or to get Israel what it wants to do with all these mixed messages. I mean, Israel has historically been at odds with the UN, so this isn't surprising at all. They do not like the UN and think that the UN is undermining it there. And so then the U.S., whenever there's some sort of humanitarian disaster or humanitarian crisis, the U.S. tries to pressure Israel with strong wording that's coming from the State Department. Now, this is all happening all at the same time while there are other actors in American politics that are sending, green lights to Israel to do whatever it wants to do. So I think this is a continuation of what has been happening already, that the U.S. makes some statements that are pressuring Israel, that says, don't cross this red line, don't do this, all the while sending billions of military aid or supporting the Israel, numerous times in UN voting. So I see this again as a perfect example of mixed signals that go towards Israel that make it very difficult for the U.S. to have any kind of leverage over it.
Natasha, thank you very much indeed. That's Natasha Lindstadt, who's Professor of Government at the University of Essex. And this is The Globalist. It is 8:12 in Vienna, 7:12 here in London. Austria's Chancellor Karl Nehammer says he will resign in the coming days, both as Chancellor and party leader, after the talks about forming a coalition government collapsed. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle Radio's senior news editor, Chris Chermak, who is in fact half Austrian, I believe. Chris,
that is correct.
If you could take us back to September and the elections, that was really the start of this current crisis.
That was the start of this crisis because in those elections, it was actually the far-right Freedom Party that won those elections, but nonetheless not with enough to actually govern. As with many European countries, they needed to form a coalition. At that point, no party wanted to work with them. It was the first time that a far-right party had won an Austrian election in the post-war period. And the other parties basically rallied around the centrist parties, if you will, to say, well, we'll try and form a coalition under the current Chancellor Karl Nehammer and try to reach a deal. And it was three parties that were working together: the centre-right People's Party, the centre-left Social Democrats, and the Neos, who are a sort of free market, liberal in the free market sense of the word, party that would have been in government for the first time. And this was all basically an effort to keep the Freedom Party out of power. And they've been trying to negotiate a coalition government for the last few months and have now failed.
And do we know why? What's the reason for the failure?
So it was the Neos that pulled out, the smallest party, if you will, of the three. They were the ones who pulled out first, and their party leader basically said that the coalition wasn't ambitious enough, that they weren't getting what they wanted out of it. And this does go to, that there's some truth there, if you will, in terms of an argument that when you have especially a kind of unruly three-party coalition, we've seen this in Germany as well, for that matter, it's hard to be ambitious, isn't it, when you have all these parties together trying to form a government. So it was the Neos who basically said, this isn't enough for us. We don't think this government is going to be strong enough, do enough for Austria. That's why we're pulling out. And at the point that they pulled out, basically the People's Party and the Social Democrats had to reverse course. They could have continued negotiations themselves, but you saw pretty quickly indications from the People's Party in particular, which is Karl Nehammer's party, or was Karl Nehammer's party. He is now resigning, saying he will resign as chancellor. Others in the party are willing to work with the far-right Freedom Party.
Was Nehammer's position untenable? Could he have stayed?
His position was basically untenable at the point that the coalition talks collapsed, yes, because he had been the main person, if you will, in the party to say, I will not work with the far right, and particularly their leader, Herbert Kickl. So he's the one who is now likely to become, or potentially to become, Chancellor of Austria. He is a quite strong nationalist far-right figure in Austrian politics. He's been a kind of leader of the party, or a big senior figure in the party for decades now, but always from the pretty far-right flank of the Freedom Party itself. So aside from the Freedom Party, if you will, being a sort of far-right party, most other officials in Austria, including the country's chancellor, the country's president, have said they do not want to see Herbert Kickl in particular in office. And so that was kind of the line drawn by the current chancellor, Karl Nehammer. When he couldn't, though, cobble any kind of coalition together, he was forced to resign, basically, because of that opposition. And others within the party are now willing to say they will enter talks with Herbert Kickl and the Freedom Party. Where exactly those go, of course, we don't know. Whether Kickl manages to get this across the line, but he is going to be having a meeting with the country's president today, Alexander van der Bellen, who is kind of the person, it's a situation in many European countries, right? The president doesn't have that much power, but is the one who is going to say, okay, it's up to this party now to try and reach a coalition government that can actually get across the line. So he is, despite his opposition, likely today or at some point this week to give Herbert Kickl that mandate, and the Freedom Party that mandate for the first time in post-war Austrian history, a far-right party, the mandate to try and form a government.
Chris, what's the history of the Freedom Party?
The history is a very back and forth. They were formed by somebody who was a former member of the Nazis back in the post-war period. They did then moderate their tone for a while and became a little bit more like, say, the Free Democrats in Germany, who are more of, that kind of free market party. And then under Jörg Haider back in sort of 80s, 90s, they once again sort of reverted to form, if you will, and moved back towards the far right. What has been interesting about them over all of this time is they've been in government at various points, right? But often as a junior coalition partner. So the People's Party has been willing to work with them before. And you've had this interesting back and forth, I think, in Austria compared to other European nations where the far right has kind of always been there. And they always sort of creep up in the polls. They reach a certain point. They get into power. There's then a scandal and they lose power again and they fall back in the polls. Then they rise again over a few years. They get back into government, but always as the junior partner. So they've always been that junior within a People's Party role where the Chancellor has been from that centre-right. This will be the first time that they really will have to prove they have what it takes and that they have, a chance to govern in Austria as the lead party in a government, potentially.
You mentioned parallels with Germany, and I wonder if the situation in Austria reflects a wider crisis in Europe with the far-right gaining ground, quite often without people agreeing to work with them.
Well, exactly. That's sort of what's been happening in a number of European countries. As the far right comes up, you see sort of other parties from the centre try and stop their rise until it's essentially too late. And you did see that in Germany as well. Of course, Germany now facing elections in February. And to this point, because the government that they currently have under Olaf Scholz has been incredibly weak, because it was a government of three parties, the Greens, the Social Democrats, the Freedom Party. You had kind of a mix of different ideologies in there that were trying to work together and basically failed to do that. And I do think that's what you've kind of seen in Austria, except they're not willing to go down that road, and that's what's been interesting. They tried for the last few months whether the centre parties could kind of form some kind of unity coalition, if you will, and they just decided they're not strong enough to do that. There was too much infighting among them, because at the end of the day, even centre parties have different ideologies, they have different opinions about the way things should be run. And again, to that point, the People's Party in particular has always had a side that is willing to work more with the right, particularly the economic wing of the party. They were the ones that pushed for a potential coalition with the Freedom Party. So they were the ones to eventually then break off now and say, let's give this a go.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Chermak there. Now, still to come on the programme.
Tell me, why is an accomplished foreign architect shoveling coal here in Philadelphia?
I'm afraid it is not so simple.
That's The Brutalist. We'll find out how it did in the Golden Globes a little later on. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Inga Thordar, who is Chief External Relations Officer at the Oceanborn Foundation and also a former senior editor at the BBC and CNN. Inga, it's lovely to have you back here in the studio with us. Now, we've just been talking about the rise of the far right in Austria, also seeing it in Germany. But of course, we're not immune to that here in the UK. And interestingly enough, Elon Musk, who has absolutely nothing to do or should have nothing to do with UK politics, is also weighing in. Tell us what's going on here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's been very, nigh on impossible to open a news site in the last few weeks without seeing Elon Musk on the front pages. He seems to be, having an opinion about pretty much every country there is. So on the far right, I mean, he had comments about the German politics recently, German obviously heading into election, where he endorsed the right-wing AfD. Now he seems to have turned his side to UK politics. And it's interesting because we all saw that sort of bromance between him and Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the Reform Party here in the UK. But that relationship seems to have soured somewhat in the last 24 hours or so, with Elon Musk posting that Mr. Farage didn't have what it took to be the leader of the Reform. That could be in response to Nigel Farage's sort of tepid response or defence of Elon Musk's calls for the release of Tommy Robinson, or even his attacks on the Prime Minister here.
Just give us a bit of background to Tommy Robinson here. Stephen Yaxley Lennon is his real name. He's serving 18 months in prison, basically because he libelled somebody. He's stirred up hate, and it was completely untrue. So they've fallen out over this. It seems like Musk is pushing Robinson, as he's known, for some kind of position.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, I think it's unclear what Elon Musk really wants from that particular sort of spat about Tommy Robinson. And it's interesting that is the issue that has really caused this rift between him and Farage, given that there is so much else that it could be, including the attacks on the Prime Minister over his handling of the grooming gangs. So it would have seemed that Tommy Robinson, who is at best an extremely controversial figure here in the UK and has certainly been involved in some, rather unseemly kind of protest over the years, that would be what makes them fall out. And of course, there has been this rumour that Elon Musk was willing to give up to 100 million to Farage's Reform Party. Now, that seems unlikely in the light of the recent spats, but you never know when it's with Musk. And it's interestingly, Adam Bolton just said over the weekend in an article for Sky News, he talked about where does he find the time? I mean, he has that new role in the Trump administration. He has many businesses that he's running, and he's got a large family, but he still finds time to get himself involved in the politics of other countries.
And why?
Well, that is it. That's the million-dollar question, I guess, is that why would he want to be? But I mean, you've heard a lot about Elon Musk, that he's a fascist, that he just wants to push that agenda. Now, he's also a big proponent and has said that loudly of free speech, that everyone should be allowed to comment on anything, and that's what his X platform stands for and is about.
Well, except that he censors people with whom he doesn't agree.
Yeah, so it's a very arbitrary free speech, I would say.
Yeah, quite extraordinary. I mean, the story is going to keep on giving, isn't it?
For sure. And I mean, I think that for many, many more weeks, if not years, we'll be opening the papers and seeing Elon Musk's face.
I mean, many of the Sunday papers today were speculating how long the bromance between Trump and Musk can last, given that they're both alpha characters, both want the spotlight. They both can't have it. Trump is going to tire of him eventually, isn't he?
Well, I mean, it's funny because you hear both sides. You hear that Elon Musk could tire of Trump as well if he doesn't get what he wants out of him, or if he doesn't push the agenda that Elon Musk seems to be interested in. Likewise, I mean, Trump will be the president of one of the most powerful countries in the world, so he won't need that sort of attention, for sure. But it does feel like, I mean, people have been reading into their body language, what they've been saying to each other, that Thanksgiving dinner, etc. But, I think that at the moment that relationship is working because they both need each other and they can benefit from that.
Yeah, quite extraordinary. Let's move on to Ukraine now. And as we're reporting in our headlines, there's a new Kursk offensive taking place by Ukraine into Russia. They've managed to go in. They've managed to hold on to that territory too. What are the papers saying about this?
Well, as you said, they've moved into Kursk now. And I think what we're seeing is that we're also seeing Russia having to defend itself in Kursk, but they are also inside Ukraine, advancing at the fastest rate since the 2022 invasion. I think that what that suggests is that both sides are trying to consolidate their positions before Trump takes power. I mean, Russia has managed to push the Ukrainians back since the offense started in Kursk in August. They've reclaimed about 40% of the lost territory, but Ukraine still controls about 600 square kilometers inside Russia. And that is what Zelensky has said will need to be part of any negotiations for peace. So he's basically trying to establish that the territory that they hold inside Russia becomes a big bargaining chip for him in any peace negotiations when Trump takes over.
Because, of course, it's going to work the other way with Russia wanting Crimea and so on, the bits they've annexed, Donetsk, to be part of that agreement.
Exactly. And I think that is what the plan is now. I mean, we're now 6th of January. Trump will come in on the 20th of January. And, he has said that he wants to resolve this quickly. He said that during the election campaign. I think Putin will be relying on Trump taking away military support to Ukraine. And I think Ukraine will be relying on Trump to move quickly on this and want to resolve it at any cost.
Let's go to Canada now. And we're hearing that Trudeau is expected to announce his exit. And he may do this before the National Caucus on Wednesday.
That's correct. These are reports that are coming in from Reuters and the Globe and Mail in Canada, saying that he could resign as early as today, although that is not confirmed. Calls for his resignation, of course, have increased in the recent weeks, fueled by the uncertainty over what Trump will do around tariffs and what that will be for the Canadian economy. Unlikely to be good. And then, of course, after Trudeau in December tried to demote the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, one of his closest ally, and she pushed back against his spending, what he wanted to be spending. And Canada obviously has a record deficit at the moment. So she ended up quitting. This has all caused big problems for Trudeau. And now his options are closing in. I mean, he can resign, obviously, and that is what everyone's expecting. He still has a few other options that are unlikely, like proroguing Parliament, that could buy him some time. But I think in the present situation, we're most likely to see him go before Wednesday.
Quite, the news today is very lively.
Of course, and of course this comes when the Liberals are doing very badly in the poll and the more sort of swing towards the right in Canada is happening too.
After that, we need a strong drink. How about sake?
Yes. I thought this story was kind of interesting because sake obviously is such a famous drink in Japan, but it has been on the decline in the last 50 years. I mean, there's been many reasons for that. I mean, they say that an elderly population, they're not drinking anymore. The young people aren't drinking sake. But in December, UNESCO gave the drink a a sort of a seal of approval, should we say. And since then, and before then even, the brewers have been trying to lure in the younger drinkers. They've been trying to do this by putting flavors in it, making it sparkling, focusing much more on the export market than they had before. And so boost sales internationally and riding the coattails of the popular Japanese cuisine. And exports have really soared in the last 5 years since then. And now they're hoping that with this UNESCO stamp of approval, it will go even further.
Inga, thank you very much indeed. That's Inga Thordar there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Russia says that Ukraine has launched a new attack in the Kursk region, an area of western Russia from which Russian troops have been trying to eject Ukrainian forces for the past 5 months. Russia currently controls about a fifth of Ukraine, but Ukraine's unexpected success in biting off and retaining a slice of Russian territory could boost its negotiating position as both sides gear up for possible peace talks this year. South Korean investigators will seek an extension of a warrant to arrest impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol, an official said today, as an anti-graft agency asked police to take over efforts to execute the arrest of the embattled leader. Meanwhile, North Korea fired what appeared to be an intermediate-range ballistic missile out to sea today, coinciding with a visit by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Seoul. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is increasingly likely to announce he intends to step down, though he hasn't made a final decision, a source familiar with Trudeau's thinking has said. Trudeau's been under increasing pressure to quit since Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland resigned over a policy clash. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's been a politically tumultuous year for French President Emmanuel Macron, a fact he acknowledged in his New Year's address to the nation. In June, he called and lost an unnecessary snap election. The country went without a government over the summer, and when an administration led by Michel Barnier was finally appointed, it lost a confidence vote in December. Consequently, France failed to approve the budget before the end of the year deadline, and Macron had to name his fourth Prime Minister in 2024, François Bayrou. So, what happens next? Well, I'm joined by Philippe Mallière, who is Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. Philippe, welcome back to the show. What did Macron say in his speech?
Good morning, Georgina. Well, I think the government and the president met last week. That was the first council of ministers led by the new Prime Minister Bayrou. And I think quite interestingly, Macron called for boldness at this meeting. I don't know what it means exactly, but I think boldness probably the new Prime Minister will need because I think we seem to be back to square one, exactly where we left it a month ago when Barnier's government was toppled. Following a vote of no confidence in the National Assembly. We're back to square one because the situation hasn't changed. In fact, we changed Prime Minister, but President Macron still doesn't have a majority to back his policies in the House. And the same issues are still there, i.e. vote the budget, which won't be easy due to lack of majority. Tackle and fight the public deficit, also difficult. So that was also part of Macron's speech, and finally there's a third issue which wasn't there when Barnier was Prime Minister, which is Mayotte, one of those overseas islands which was devastated by a cyclone. And I think which gave a very rough start, by the way, to Bayrou, because he was criticized for failing to fly to Mayotte, to be there in person. So that's on the face of it, there's been a change, a new prime minister, but I think the problems and the situation remain largely the same.
I mean, I thought it was very interesting that Macron basically owned it. He said, lucidity and humility forced me to recognise that at this stage, the decision has produced the decision to call an election has produced more instability than peace, and I fully own up to that. And I thought that was telling that he was really taking responsibility for the huge crisis that's been crippling the nation.
Indeed, and that was one of the rare admissions on the part of Macron of his own responsibility for the current situation. As you said in your introduction, that was an unnecessary snap election. Didn't have to dissolve the National Assembly, could govern without an absolute majority. Now that the chamber is, it's a complete deadlock. No bloc. There are three blocs: the left, Macron's bloc, a little bit of the Conservative Party, the Republicans, and another big bloc, which is the far right, the National Rally. And none of them, and even when there is a combination of two blocs, which is the current government, it's the Macronists together with the Republicans governing, they also fall short of a majority. So very inextricable situation. And yes, he conceded that. Macron conceded that it was his responsibility. But in the meantime, he is not the prime minister. So the role of the president is to be a kind of arbiter, if you like, to be in charge of international relations. But he doesn't govern on a day-to-day basis. And that will be Bayrou's difficult task.
So, obviously many feel that Bayrou's government can't last very long. If or when an attempt to topple him comes, do you think that will be from the far right or from the socialists?
I think it will be probably a combination of both, like in the previous government. Barnier was failed because the left bloc had put forward a motion of no confidence, which was finally voted by the far right. I think the same could happen. It could happen as early as February next month, because next month the discussions on the budget will be put again. Will be tabled and put before the deputies. So the government could fall, but who knows? Who knows? Because of course there's also a lot of tactical voting going on, in the sense that the French seem to be getting tired of this political instability. So no one will want at some point to be seen as provoking even more instability by censoring the government. So it's a kind of a tactical game as well as a game of opposition. But make no mistake, that government lifespan won't be very long, and I think it could be also a matter of months before Bayrou has to quit his role as prime minister.
So we know that there's a wide open election coming in 2027. Macron can't stand in that. I wonder if the socialists have either a vision or a suitable candidate.
That's the problem of the socialists and the problem of the left altogether. I think, although because one has to distinguish, the left is plural. It's not simply the socialist, i.e. the equivalent of the Labour Party in the UK. There are also other parties, notably on the radical left, a party called France Insoumise and Bald France, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Mélenchon will be a candidate, whatever the circumstances. So it's difficult for the left, because the left is split when it comes to the presidential election. There will be more than one candidate. And to date, the socialists haven't been able really to put forward a kind of a household name, a trusted politician, a seasoned politician as well. That is missing. Long gone are the days of where the Socialist Party had, big figures such as François Mitterrand, Lionel Jospin, and they've all retired or died. So that's the problem of the main centre-left party, is the lack of competent and popular personnel.
And just finally, who's in the wings then? When this government does inevitably fall, what happens then?
Well, there will be a need for a new. First of all, Macron will have, if he's still there, because I think there are also now talks about a potential resignation of Macron if things really get from bad to worse. There will be a need for a new prime minister. That's the procedure. The president appoints the prime minister, and then the prime minister is responsible for forming a government. So there will be a new government. And I think the whole idea, I believe, and that's what I think people think in France now, politicians, but also the media, is that there will be another general election next summer, or probably next September at the latest, because you can't carry on like this, with no government will have a majority this term. So there will be a new election. with the hope this time that there will be a sort of workable majority in the House. But of course, we're not there, and I think there's still a few months to go before the summer.
Philippe, thank you very much indeed. Philippe Mallière there. You're with Monocle Radio. It's 16:39 in Tokyo, 8:39 in Zurich. A year ago, the Japanese company Nippon Steel, the world's fourth largest steel maker, announced a deal to acquire US Steel. The arrangement, worth $14.9 billion, was a lifeline for the American company that has over a century of history, but is now much diminished. However, the takeover's been blocked by President Joe Biden, a move that the Japanese government calls incomprehensible. Well, Harry Dempsey is Tokyo correspondent for the Financial Times, and he joins us on the line now. Harry, hello to you. Thanks for coming on the show. What would a Nippon-US Steel merger have looked like?
Well, you would have had a much enlarged company. You would have brought Japan's largest steelmaker together with an iconic US steelmaker, and in particular, the Japanese company has a lot of technology to decarbonize the steelmaking process, as well as to make specialty steel, which is used in a lot of the industries that the US cares about.
And why has Biden blocked it?
And so Biden has blocked it on national security concerns, and they're primarily concerned that Nippon Steel would have reduced production at some of the sites in the US, and that would have had a negative impact on the US steelmaking industry. There was, however, a national security review by CFIUS, which is the US interagency body that reviews transactions for national security risks. And they could not agree on whether this transaction would have posed national security risks to the US. And so Biden has made that decision in the light of a rather inconclusive process in the US.
How's it being seen in Japan?
Well, they're seeing this as a real affront from a diplomatic standpoint. From the Japanese point of view, they are the closest ally of the US in Asia Pacific. They are essentially the US military's front line for any conflict with China, given that there's bases here. And so for the US to turn around and say, you know, one of your steelmaking companies buying an American steelmaker with a plan to make large investments, promises to safeguard jobs, to essentially provide a way for it to become a stronger company, to then turn around and say that that is a national security threat. To them, it's both a diplomatic affront, but it's also it's making light of what the US calls its own national security review process. And there'll be concerns that the due process hasn't been followed here, and Nippon Steel has been suggesting that it may sue the US government for failing to follow due process.
And do you think that there's a chance the deal could be revisited under the Trump administration?
I definitely think it could be. Trump is a deal maker. He's transactional. And so I think if this does go to litigation, which seems highly likely, the US government could be bogged down in this litigation, and the future of US Steel could also be uncertain. And US Steel has a lot of its steel plants based in Pennsylvania, which is a crucial swing state in the US elections. So, I mean, on one hand, it was perhaps folly by the Japanese company to try and do this in an election year, but on the other hand, if there's no other way to save these jobs than bar having a stronger owner, then Trump could well turn back towards the Japanese.
And finally, I mean, how much will this damage ties between the US and Japan, and does it have worrying implications for other foreign investors in the US?
I think so. So Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has already said today that Japanese businesses were voicing concerns to him about future plans to invest in the US. This is obviously sort of complicated hugely by Trump threatening to put tariffs on exports from neighboring countries. And a lot of the Japanese companies are heavily invested in places like Mexico. And therefore, it's gone from a position where they were thinking, oh, perhaps we need to beef up our presence within the US and have more domestic manufacturing, to thinking now, well, if we do a deal in order to boost our presence in the US, will Trump or come in and block this in the same way that Nippon Steel has had their proposed plans blocked?
Harry, thank you very much indeed. That's Harry Dempsey, Tokyo correspondent for the Financial Times. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now we're going to join Erin Cook, the Jakarta-based journalist and author of Diary Mulut Ke Mulut, a newsletter about Southeast Asia. She joins us now from Jakarta to give us a look at some Asian news. Erin, thanks for coming on the programme. Can you just bring us up to speed with what's going on in South Korea? We know that the authorities have failed to arrest the impeached president, but they're pushing to extend that warrant to the end of today.
Yes, it's the political drama that never ends for South Korea. So the arrest warrant, which should have resulted in the arrest of former president, now impeached president, Yoon Suk-yeol on Friday, which never really eventuated. That was kind of a bit of a bust for investigators. That warrant expires tonight, midnight Seoul time. So investigators want it extended. Democracy supporters across Korea want to see that extended. And a lot of foreign allies as well, the US especially, want to see that extended, so we get a bit of justice going there in Seoul.
And they're also wanting to pass the investigation on to another branch of the authorities.
Yes, they want to kick it over to the anti-corruption investigators. Whether it's something that's probably easy to sting him on anti-corruption rather than the sort of political insurgency that they were investigating him under initially, remains to be seen. But I think the bigger issue is just getting something done. This has been a bit of a stalemate for a few weeks now. And Koreans are getting very, very fed up with it. We need to see a bit of movement in one direction, one way or the other.
And are there people still outside his residence? I mean, we've seen a lot of public support and also, of course, a lot of public appropriation.
Yes, it's a bit of a tricky one, it must be, for security and law enforcement there at the moment. There are supporters gathering out the front of his property, but as well as plenty of detractors. The supporters are getting more and more vocal. They're calling now on incoming US President Trump to get involved. They're saying this is really similar to when, the Americans stole the election off you in 2020. So it could turn into a bit of a thing in the next few weeks.
Right, let's have a look at Afghanistan now, because a group of Afghan nationals have arrived in the Philippines. They're on their way to the US as part of an immigrant processing deal. Tell us more.
Yes, this is a very, very big deal between the Philippines and the US last year. So the US had wanted to do something after its sort of shock getting out of Afghanistan back then in 2021. They left a lot of people there that a lot of people in power wanted to go back and get. And this is sort of the way of bridging that gap, so to speak. So the State Department in the US and their equivalents in the Philippines haven't said how many Afghan nationals have arrived in the Philippines. They're not disclosing that number, and they are expected to stay there for only 2 months maximum before heading off to the US once everything's been sort of set up and those visas are through the system. And whether it's a case of this is the first lot of people and this is going to be a consistent sort of collaboration between the two countries remains unclear, but it did happen quite quietly. It was sort of just announced as it happened rather than, preparing in advance for weeks for it.
Finally, let's go to Thailand. And a very odd story. I had no idea that massages could be fatal.
No, and this is a very sad one because I go to Thailand all the time for work and never even occurred to me to worry about it. But there have been two shock stories in the last couple of months where a Singaporean woman in the Thai resort island of Phuket died after receiving one of Thailand's famous massages. A Thai singer also died around that same period, and her death was supposed to be linked to a massage, but investigation since sort of cleared that up. But there were fears are definitely remaining. So public health experts are saying, maybe this is a good time to bring in a bit of reform into the industry. Let's get everybody all on side. Let's get some regulation going. This is an intangible cultural asset as far as UNESCO is concerned, and an enormous, enormous part of the huge tourism industry. So let's take a look at certification. Let's take a look at health and safety in the workplace, all that sort of stuff. So maybe these two very sad freak deaths could have some good things come out of them.
Erin, thank you very much indeed. That's Erin Cook there. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Last night, the 82nd Golden Globes took place in Los Angeles. The event marks the first major ceremony of the film awards season, which culminates with the Oscars on the 2nd of March. Well, film critic Karen Krisanovich has been up for most of the night watching and joins me now bravely to discuss the results. You look remarkably well on what must have been very little sleep.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my makeup artist for this.
Karen, just firstly, how do the Golden Globes differ from the Oscars?
Well, they started in 1944, and they've had that huge scandal in 2021 where they had to revamp completely. And now they've got over 300 members from 76 countries. And generally, these are foreign journalists, foreign meaning not American. And so the big difference is that the Oscars, this is not a forerunner. The Golden Globes are not a forerunner for the Oscars, because the Oscars are a hometown, industry-based, although global awards. This is really more of, as I said, foreign journalists picking out their favorites.
And it's also across television, and it doesn't honour people like screenwriters or rather cinematographers and that sort of thing.
No, it isn't. It isn't big on tech. It's big on sort of popularity and what people watch.
All right. So what have we been watching? Who are the big winners?
Well, the big winners are sort of predictably, I don't want to say esoteric, and I don't want to say not fun to watch, but I mean, the ones that are chosen are the ones that sort of poke you in the eye a little bit. Okay, the best film drama was The Brutalist, which is a beautiful film made on a really small budget and is really a bum number, I have to say, because it's really, really long. It has a. I'm not going to go on and on. The best, I'd love to, though. It does have an intermission at the wrong place, but don't get me started. Emilia Perez won his best film comedy musical, and that is a musical about a Mexican cartel chieftain who becomes a trans woman. Surprise! Okay, but Zoe Saldana won for it, which is, I think, her best supporting, which is absolutely amazing, and I'm really pleased about that. I'm not sure where else you want me to go. Adrian Brody won Best Film Drama Actor, and that is again for The Brutalist. And as Nikki Glaser, who is the host tonight, the first woman to host the Golden Globes, said tonight, two-time Holocaust survivor Adrian Brody, because of course the piano.
Dear, oh dear. Tell us about Nikki Glaser in the role of host.
She is incredible. She's really incredible. She said she's done this performance 92, 93 times, and she was really brilliant. She's a stand-up comedian. She's noted mostly for roasts. She's very confident. I mean, she looks great. Her delivery is amazing. And she just doesn't flinch. You know, she's got a really steely eye. But some of her comments were just absolutely incredible, really funny. And, you know, Nicky Gervais, who didn't get the gig this year, tweeted two of the things that he would use. And, you know, the difference between Nikki Glaser and Ricky Gervais is that Nikki really kept it on the funny, razzy side, where I think that Ricky Gervais is taking somewhat of an older line.
Tell us about his brother, Kieran Culkin.
Ah, yeah. Well, he was great in Succession, and he has made this sort of two-hander with Jesse Eisenberg called The Real Pain, which is about visiting their Jewish roots in Poland. And it's a comedy, and it's very, very lightweight. But it was really lovely to see, and we know that Kieran Culkin can really act, and he goes beyond what we saw him in as Roman Roy, the unusual son in Succession. And it was lovely. I mean, the Culkins are a great acting family, and I think it's great to see him get this. In particularly tough circumstances, he went against Jeremy Strong, Guy Pearce, Edward Norton, and Denzel Washington.
Now, last year we saw The Bear sweep the board. Yeah. Did that happen again?
Well, The Bear won best comedy acting. No, sorry, it was best. I think it might be best comedy acting actor. But the third series was not as welcomed, and it was very unusual and esoteric. And I think that it's. I'm surprised that it actually won anything this year, to be quite honest. And this is typical of the Golden Globes, that they'll pick up on things that resonate in ways that the Oscars never would.
The Japanese-American epic Shogun
did very well.
It did, didn't it?
Did very, very well. Yeah, which is lovely. And again, this reflects the Golden Globes' international viewpoint. I mean, granted, it was very popular with domestic viewers. I mean, American viewers really loved it. But to give these sort of nods to actors that we wouldn't ordinarily see is really one of the strong points of the Golden Globes.
Only Murders in the Building, which I have to say I've been disappointed with the later series.
Yeah,
that was nominated for 4 awards. Did it pick them up?
Well, I'm primarily focusing on films.
Yeah.
So I know that Selena Gomez was there with her new boyfriend, and Nikki Glaser points out that he was only given this wish by a great genie, and I was a bit naughty, but that's typical of her.
Oh dear. Right, on to your personal recommendations.
I mean, what you should watch to get ready for the Oscars? Probably none of these Golden Globe winners, to be honest. Although Emilia Perez, which again is such an unusual project, it did very well at Cannes, but it will challenge most viewers. And I know this because I've got a partner at home who really doesn't want to watch anything groundbreaking. And I have to say, I'm Still Here, Fernando Torres won for Best Drama Actress. Do watch that. The Substance, Demi Moore, definitely watch The Substance.
Yeah, I was reading that this was the first time she'd had an award in her career.
Yeah, which I find hard to believe because she's so good. She was told 30 years ago by a producer that she's a popcorn actress and not to expect any awards. But this is the wonderful thing about focusing on older performers in general. Although I think Jean Smart it was Jennifer Coolidge made a joke about that. But we're beginning to see how these women can blossom in their careers. Jennifer Coolidge said she wants to give a nod to all the men in their the older men in their careers. She knows how hard it is to support a series.
That's hilarious. And finally, the frocks. We've always
I knew you were going to ask me. I've been sweating it out in the kitchen here. I've got 3 of them for you. Zendaya won a Capri Orange Louis Vuitton. And Angelina Jolie wore a silvery Alexander McQueen, and Cate Blanchett wore a gold Louis Vuitton as well.
Well, from Karen in her leather jacket, thank you very much indeed. Karen Krasanovic there. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Chris Chermak and Monica Lillis, our researcher, Gunnar Grinlid, and our studio manager, Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and The Briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.